Hello, so my name's Dr. Dave Millard. I'm from Electronics and Computer Science at the University of Southampton in the UK. And in this video presentation, I'm going to be talking about the Flâneur and the Psychogeographer. And really that's just a way in to discuss locative literature, which is essentially any kind of story that you might read on a device, on a digital device, when you're out and about in a particular location. Now there's all sorts of different names for locative literature. So for example, you'll get people talking about location-based storytelling. Some people use the phrase ambient literature. Some people frame it as games. They'll talk about locative games, or they'll talk about locative narratives. And the technology itself has a number of different names. So many systems just use something like GPS. But you can have sort of more integrated sets of technology, sometimes called mixed reality. You can overlay graphics on the environment. That's sometimes called augmented reality. Sometimes systems which use all of those things all together and kind of place you in this kind of hybrid space are called hybrid or extended reality. But they're all talking about the same thing, which is essentially accessing content on a digital device in location in order to have some kind of narrative experience. Now, I've been involved in doing this work for quite a long time. One of my very first positions was as a research fellow on a project called Equator. And we did a sub-project as part of that based at Chawton House in Hampshire, which is a house associated with Jane Austen. Jane Austen lived in the village and wrote many of her novels there, and is associated with a house which is now a library of women's literature. But we had a project which was taking school kids out to the grounds of Chawton House and trying to use this digital experience, this kind of locative narrative or locative game, to try and teach them about what it would have been like to have lived and to have worked in that house in the past. Now, back in 2003, when we started the project, technology wasn't what it was today. So for example, we had no mobile data, so we had to create Wi-Fi base stations using batteries, and we kind of created our own units. We hid them in the trees in the grounds of the house in order to get network coverage. And even the devices we were using, we had sort of basic sort of mobile devices, but they didn't have built-in GPS, so we kind of literally had to duct tape the GPS devices to the back of the mobile devices that people were using to get it all to work. Nevertheless, it did work, and the kids could come and explore the grounds of the house. They'd meet different characters, hear them in conversation, and they'd be given activities and different things to do. So move forward, 18 years, and of course now we're very used to this idea of kind of locative games or narratives. So many of you will have heard about the game Pokemon Go. So this is a mobile game. You can download it for both Android and iOS. And basically what it lets you do is it lets you go out and hunt virtual Pokemon in the area around you. And it's an enormously successful game. So it launched in 2016. Was followed up by a Wizards Unite, a Harry Potter game by the same producers a few years later. And to date, Pokemon Go has made Niantic something like $3 billion. That's the kind of lifetime revenue. So this is not really a niche subject. This is now quite big business, and I suspect will go on to become much, much bigger business. Because now, of course, unlike 2003, all of us have a location-aware computing device in our pocket, and therefore have access to these types of experiences. So, what types of these experiences are we talking about? So, I just gave you an example for Chawton House where we were doing an experience with kids, and Pokemon is obviously a game, but there are lots of other types of experiences that you might think of doing around locative narratives. So, for example, the University of York back in 2006. They produced an application called Riot, which was set in Queen Square in Bristol during a riot. And basically what happened is that you can wander around the square, you can read about what's happening in the riot in different locations, and it progresses over time. So depending on where you go, you can follow different stories and see different aspects of the event. The island of Madeira is a kind of a walking tour of Funchal, which is the capital city in Madeira. It doesn't use GPS, it uses these kind of symbols that you find that are placed in strategic locations around the city. Part of the experience is hunting and finding those symbols. Partly it's about learning about the parts of the city and the life of the inhabitants of the city. And it kind of takes you on a tour and sort of gives you a kind of a narrative version of that city as a way of understanding the people and the place. And Viking Ghost Hunt was created by Trinity College in Dublin in 2013, and it's based on the kind of very rich set of ghost stories that exist around Dublin. So you can take your mobile device, you can visit one of many locations where you'll meet a virtual ghost. Actually appears as a sort of an AR display on your mobile device, and then you can go on a little story with that ghost, and it's kind of a little interactive story, and different things might happen depending on what you do. You also see kind of commercial work as well. So Six to Start produced a game called Zombies Run back in 2012, which is a game that you play while you're out on your run. So essentially, you get ready to go for your run, you put your earbuds in, and then you go on a mission where you are pursued by hordes of ravenous zombies through your earphones. And there are many different types of missions. So, for example, you might be asked to do a medical supply out to the hospital. And as you do these missions on your daily run over time, you learn more about the zombie apocalypse, about the different characters, about why things are the way they are. And again, your progress through each of those stories is based on your progress through the run, the distance you have travelled. So all of this has been going on, and I kind of, as I said, I was involved in this back in the early 2000s, and have been keeping a kind of an eye on all of these developments. And I thought it was time to kind of come back and revisit this topic, and that was around sort of 2016. So we had a project in Southampton called StoryPlaces. It was a joint project between computer science and English, and it was all about exploring stories that responded to location. But we wanted to kind of go back to basics. So we kind of didn't worry about some of the more advanced location technologies or display technologies. We wanted to talk about text. We wanted to work directly with authors. And the question we were really asking is, how do these locative stories work? How do you use, how does place affect your understanding of story? How does story affect your understanding of place? And what are the things that writers should be doing to make their stories work in different kind of locations? All right. So that was the premise of the project. So the very first thing we did in the project is we wanted to understand how locative stories are put together. So we really did an analysis of various stories that we could see in the literature and in various different applications. And we saw that there were kind of three fundamental structures: canyons, deltas, and plains. So canyons are essentially a kind of a linear sequence of things. So we call those content items nodes. So canyons are a linear sequence of nodes that you access in a predefined order. So you'd go from location A to location B to location C, and it kind of takes you on that kind of linear tour. On the other hand, deltas are things that give you choices. So for example, you might start off if you're on a university campus, you might start off outside the Students' Union, and you'll have a choice of two different destinations. You can either go to the library or you can go to the theatre. And if you chose to go to the library, the theatre option will be closed off to you, and then another two choices will be opened up. So this is a good way of giving people kind of interactive stories where they can actually make choices, certainly about how the story is experienced, but possibly about what actually happens in the story as well. And then lastly, we have planes, which are kind of collections of nodes which are all available right from the beginning. So it's a kind of a large space. You can wander around, you can go in any order you like, and you can access those nodes and find out a little bit about them. So whereas a canyon is a bit more like a sort of a tour guide, a plane is a bit more like an interactive map where you're free to kind of move around and discover things in the order that you like. The interesting thing about these three structures is that they can be used to explain pretty much any locative story that's out there. So, for example, if you think about Chawton House, that I talked about at the beginning, that actually starts off with a canyon, so a sequence of things that every child sees before it opens up into a plain, and they're free to explore the grounds of the house, discover conversations, read little bits of poetry, find information, in whatever order following their kind of interests. And then after a certain time limit, that plane closes and the students or the pupils are pushed into another canyon where they do another sequence of tasks, ending with a kind of a larger class exercise. If you think about Riot, which was the storytelling, the story of the Queen Square riot in Bristol, you can think about that as a sequence of planes. So what happens is you come into the square, you're free to move about, you can meet the characters, you can find out what's going on, and then at a certain time, all of that information is replaced by a new layer of information that represents the next stage of the story, the next sequence of things that happened that night. And that happens throughout the story. And it kind of creates this sort of interactive play that's happening around you that you can choose to move around, but which ultimately progresses over time. Viking Ghost Hunt is a plane leading to a delta. So each of the ghosts that are featured, they are in the plane at the beginning, and you're free to move around and visit whichever one you want to. But at the point where you interact with one of those ghosts, you then move into this delta. You move into this kind of interactive story where your decisions have kind of consequences for what happens with that interaction. So what we did with StoryPlaces is we took that idea and we built it into an app. So it's a web app. It's deliberately minimal. So although it does have some multimedia, it's primarily focused around text. And we built it around a sculptural hypertext engine. And I'm not going to say too much about what that is, just to say that sculptural hypertext is a kind of a model of hypertext that can support each of those three things that we were talking about: canyons, deltas, and planes. So what that means is that using StoryPlaces, you can sort of replicate the structure of pretty much any locative narrative that's been developed over the last 20 years. And what we wanted to do was to use this to try and understand, well, with all of that power at their disposal, what would writers do? What sorts of stories would they construct? How would they go about creating things? And then how would readers react to those different types of stories? So the first thing we did is we interacted with a group of creative writing students at the University of Southampton, and they came up with 40 different stories using the StoryPlaces structure. And in fact, at this point, we didn't have an authoring system. So they authored this all on paper, writing down the instructions that they would want StoryPlaces to implement. And we had people write dramas and thrillers, tour guides, horror stories, poetry, all sorts of different genres. None of them were enormously long, but most of them were kind of, were 10 plus nodes of content. Spread around Southampton. So the only brief we gave them was that we wanted to create stories around the old town of Southampton. When we analysed the stories that the students had done, we found that the majority of them had done either canyons or planes. So canyons, remember, are straight linear stories where you just go from A to B to C to D, so on. And planes are stories where the story is broken up into multiple bits, but you're free to read them in any order. So relatively few students then combine some of those things together. So canyons going into planes or canyons going in to deltas. And that's probably because these students were used to linear writing. They weren't students who are practiced in the kind of interactive writing style you get in interactive fiction or for games. And I think if we had that, we'd have had more people explore some of the more challenging structures. Okay, so at this point of the project, we'd identified the sorts of structures that people were using, and we had a piece of software that could support those structures, but we still didn't really understand how the stories worked with place, and what the experience was like for the people reading those stories. So that was the next stage of the project. So what we did is we did two different placements. We continued on with some of those stories for Southampton, and we also worked with the Bournemouth Natural Science Society down in Bournemouth, and we developed a whole range of stories. We had more than 50 authors that we worked with in total, but we picked 12 of those stories, 6 in Southampton and 6 in Bournemouth, which we actually deployed on the StorySpaces system. And then we ran a number of events where we helped people get those stories up on their mobile phones. We sent them out to experience them in the actual environment, and then we interviewed them afterwards, or we went out with them and we actually ran observations of what they were doing. And we were trying to understand how they experienced those stories and what being in a particular place meant for their interpretation of those of the stories they were reading. So we kind of picked out a number of different themes. One of the minor themes was just about learning. So people would actually learn things about the place that they didn't necessarily know. Some of that stuff was very specific. So it was kind of specific pieces of information or facts, things that people didn't necessarily know beforehand. But quite a lot of people were talking about sort of more relational things. So they were talking about how one place related to another, or perhaps how a place had changed over time. So people talked about, in this case, thinking about all the different worlds that have been folded into one particular place. So it seemed to encourage this kind of deep consideration and reflection of what a place was, and how places are constituted and how they came to be. And that leads us to our sort of second theme, which is exactly that, appreciation. So sometimes this was very straightforward. So people were saying, "Oh, I'm discovering new things about the city that I didn't know. I didn't know this was here. I'd never come down this street. I'd never been here." But also, again, sometimes it went beyond that. It was really about rediscovery. So it was about saying, "Well, I've passed this thing thousands of times. I've been past this site many times in my life, but I've never really stopped to look at it or to think about why it's here, or what its relationship it is with this other building up the road, which has a similar kind of architecture." So we called that rediscovery, kind of a reinterpretation of things that you already knew about in the city. Now, both learning and appreciation were both relatively minor, and actually mostly what people talked about was something that we labelled as attention. So that's basically talking about how well the place and the story are working together to hold your attention in kind of balance. So sometimes people would talk about where that was working, and that would be a harmonious relationship, and sometimes there was discord and the story and the place clashed. So, for example, an example of that would be when the story started talking about something in the environment that was no longer there, and then the reader would start searching for it in the environment, and they'd lose concentration on the story, and they'd be kind of torn away from the experience, and it would kind of fracture the experience and spoil it a little bit for them. Whereas harmony is the opposite, where there's some kind of resonance between the story and the place. Perhaps something in the description kind of makes you resonates with something that's around you. Maybe the story talks about the crying of seagulls, and just as you read that line, seagulls cry overhead, and it kind of creates this amazing connection between the story and the place. And when our readers were reflecting on the experience, they constantly came back to these. Now, our readers called them special moments, kind of moments of these special moments of connection. But actually, they've been talked about in the literature for since the 2000s, and they tend to be talked about magic moments. And they're these kind of, as I said, they're these times where the story and the place just kind of seem to resonate. And then all of a sudden, you get this kind of experience which is unlike just visiting normally, and unlike just reading the story, but kind of transcends both, and it becomes more than the sum of its parts. So what our analysis of how readers experience the stories kind of told us was that there are kind of a couple of different ways to think about readers of locative stories. Now, in the literature, when all this started, people were very inspired by the idea of the Flâneur. So this is the stroller, the kind of came out of 19th century Paris. It's this observer of urban life who kind of moves through the city dispassionately, seeing what's going on around him or her. And we do see some of that in our readers. So when they're talking about learning specific things, when they're talking about discovering new things, they're talking about the experience of the Flâneur, about finding things out and kind of moving through the space. But that doesn't seem to get to the heart of what's going on. So a different model would be the model of the psychogeographer. So psychogeography is essentially a process where you try to experience locations in new ways and see it through new eyes. So a good example of this, a kind of a simple psychogeography technique, would be to get a map of the city, lay it out on the floor, and then throw a ruler down onto it, and then draw a line up wherever the ruler fell. And then one afternoon you go out and you walk that line. And the reason you do that is that it takes you away from the conventional paths. Not only do you visit places that you wouldn't normally visit, but you move through the city in a way that you wouldn't normally do. It kind of challenges your presumptions about how how the city is constituted, how it fits together. So this has been described as a very powerful act, a kind of a very playful way of interacting with the city. And I think actually our readers are probably much better identified as psychogeographers than they are as flâneurs. If you think about their relational learning, about how they're figuring out how bits of the urban spaces are fitting together in new ways through story, how they're rediscovering and reinterpreting elements around them, and of course how that is then all enabled by this balance and this alignment between story and place. So having gone through this analysis and understood the kind of the reader experience, we wanted then to try and turn that into kind of some advice for authors and create a kind of a toolkit for authors. And essentially we see this as being about the balance of attention between the story and the place. And as I said, it's not about just trying to keep both in balance, but it's about saying that when both are in balance, something magical happens, right? You create the opportunity for these magic moments, and you create the opportunity for an experience that transcends the experience of being in place or of reading a story and becomes more than either of them. And you do have forces working against you. So, for example, you have all sorts of distractions in the place that will draw a reader's attention. There might be bugs or errors in the software, or the technology might not work. Your GPS signal might fail. And those are things which will bring the reader's attention back to the real world and tear them away from the story. And there are all sorts of social forces going on as well. Your reader might have to make their way through a crowd. They might bump into somebody they know and end up having the whole conversation with them. So all of those things are fighting against this kind of balance. And at the same time, there are elements within the story that can cause problems too, particularly if the structure or the theme of the story is kind of misaligned with the space. If those connections aren't present, then what happens is the reader gets absorbed into the story, and they end up just standing on the corner of the street reading their smartphone rather than having this kind of integrated experience. So what we try to do is we try to look at what we'd observed, and we try to turn them into a number of different rules that authors might be able to follow. Now, the first set of rules are things we call deal breakers. And what's interesting about deal breakers is that they appear to be self-evident. So when I explain to you in a moment, they're not going to surprise you, but our authors still overlook them. So particularly when we work with all those student authors, many of them made these kind of mistakes. And that's because when they were writing, they were concentrating on the story and not necessarily the place. And really the key message behind our deal breakers is that place is king, right? You really have to think about the experience of the reader on location. So we only had 3 of these. Our first one was that you should consider points of arrival and departure. So people will come into a space typically from a particular direction. They will then do the experience, they will read the story, and then they'll leave again. And you have to try and make sure that the beginning of your story is an appropriate place. It's close to where they arrive in the space, and the end of the story is close to where they depart, right? The second one is that you have to be mindful that it takes effort for readers to move. So if you go with your natural tendency, what you might do is you might say, I've got a scene here that happens in a warehouse, so I need to put this in a warehouse somewhere, right? But if that warehouse is half a mile away from where the reader is when they activate that thing and it becomes available to them, then they have to walk a huge distance to get there. So you mustn't think about just where things are most appropriate to be, but also where the reader is likely to be and how they will move through the space, right? And be thoughtful about that. And the other thing is you have to consider the total time to read. So how long would they typically be visiting this space? How much time would they normally allocate to it? It's no use having a story that takes 5 hours to read if most people are only going to be interested in engaging with something for about an hour. And like I said, if you get any of these wrong, then readers will simply not do your story, or as soon as they discover that this is going on, they will just give up and stop. There were a set of sort of smaller pragmatic considerations we found as well. These are things you need to do to kind of create a realistic physical experience that works with the landscape, that kind of that has that harmony rather than discord. So, for example, we said you should use landscape to control navigation. The landscape has paths in it. People will move through it in a particular way. And you can use that to control navigation through your story. So, for example, if I have two nodes, A and B, and I want to make sure that A is read before B, then I could put a condition in the system that says you must have read A before B becomes available. But if I just put A and B on a path, where people will encounter A earlier in the path than B, then naturally people will read them in that order. And generally speaking, we found that doing that and kind of showing people where things were and allowing the natural routes through the environment to control their progress was preferable. We also saw that you could use bottlenecks in the landscape to your advantage. So this always happens around kind of things like crossroads, gateways, anywhere where people are kind of funneled in and then go out again. You can put crucial information in your story at those locations, and then you can kind of guarantee that people will encounter it. Right, so that's a very useful technique to use as well. We talked about identifying high-cost locations. So that might be things that were far away, or it might be something at the top of a hill, for example, or something at the other side of a busy street, somewhere that's difficult to get to. And we said, be aware of what those high-cost locations are, and then be thoughtful about how you use them. So either avoid using them, or if you are going to use them, if you're going to put a story element at the top of a massive hill, then make it a kind of an optional element and treat the story segment that's at the top of the hill as a kind of a reward for someone who's a bit of a completist. And we also saw that you really do have to think carefully about accessibility and the reader's safety. What's the accessibility of the locations that you're talking about? Is it possible for all readers to visit them or not? And also, how dangerous are they? So one of our Southampton stories, for example, the author actually used time of day as one of the conditions. So they said you had to go to this kind of very sort of lonely area of the city in the middle of the night in order to activate the story. And that's clearly not a particularly safe thing to direct readers to do. So you have to be a bit thoughtful about that as well. There also are a set of sort of aesthetic considerations that ways that you can set up the story to kind of increase its impact effectively by getting the landscape and the story to work together. So you can use kind of narrative areas. So, for example, if your story has 3 acts and you have a 3-act structure, you might run each of those acts in 3 different distinct spaces. So as the reader progresses through the story, they feel that they are progressing through the space. You should identify points of interest in the landscape. People will naturally be drawn to things like historic buildings and statues and parks and squares and these kind of locations. So you should integrate them into your story in some way, and that will help people navigate. It will draw their attention, and it won't leave them wondering, well, I wonder why they haven't talked about this big obvious thing over here in the story. It's sort of a part of the experience. We saw that you should use diegetic references carefully. So diegetic references means references in the story to things in the real world. So my example earlier on about the call of birds, for example, is a diegetic reference. And the reason you should use them carefully is because they are one of the easiest ways to create those kind of those magic moments, right? If you mention something in environment and the reader hears it, or they look up and they see it in front of them, then it's a very easy way into those magic moments. But at the same time, if they look up and those things aren't there, it becomes a distraction. So I think you have to think about using them very carefully. So you either have to reference things directly, which you are almost guaranteed will be there in the future. So a historic building that's been there for 500 years isn't going to disappear overnight, probably. So that's okay to reference. Whereas, somebody with a hot dog stand on the corner, right, might well not be there tomorrow. So it isn't such a good idea to reference. So that's kind of what we mean. And also you should write to hold attention. So there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of those distractions. And the way that you fight those distractions is to kind of give people snippets of information that they can experience, in a sensible time. So this is not just about writing that fits on the phone screen, although that does help too. But it's writing that means that they're not just stood somewhere staring at their phone for 10 minutes and reading thousands of words, but they're kind of referring to their phone, they're looking up, they're moving, so that the reading kind of holds their attention by being short, snappy, and fitting in with the wider experience rather than trying to overwhelm it. So lastly, I want to talk about an experience that we put together at the end of the StoryPlaces project, which is a story called Fallen Branches by a professional writer we work with called Lyons. And it really tried to bring together all of the things we'd learned in the earlier stages of the project. Now, Fallen Branches is set in Crystal Palace Park. Crystal Palace, which was the largest glass structure in the world when it was constructed, was actually built in 1851 for the Great Exhibition and was originally in Hyde Park. But it was moved to Crystal Palace Park in Sydenham in 1854, where it stood for about 80 years. And then just before World War II, it was actually burnt to the ground in a fire. Although it was a glass structure, the skeleton of the building was wood, and an enormous amount of wood was used in its construction. And unfortunately, there was a fire, and the whole building was destroyed. And it was never rebuilt. But a lot of the kind of the remnants of the building are still at Crystal Palace. So if you visit it today, for example, you'll find the kind of the terraces that were constructed, the avenues that were constructed. You'll find statues in the environment. There's a fabulous park with a wonderful rendition of a Victorian vision of what dinosaurs might have looked like. So that's the environment that we were working with. And Katie wrote a really lovely story about a woman called Sandy Fenton, who arrives at Crystal Palace Park trying to understand a part of her lost family history. So she's bringing with her a number of family heirlooms, and she's planning to meet the curator of the Crystal Park Museum, which is a small building that's on site. And she also has a series of letters from her great uncle, which kind of indicate that there may be a kind of a lost part of the family. And she's meeting a woman who says that she knows something about the woman Blanche, who's mentioned in the letters. So that's the kind of the setup for the story. Now, the structure of the Crystal Palace story is based around sort of three main areas. So the first one of which is a linear sequence of nodes, a kind of a canyon, if you like, that takes you through the park. And this represents Sandy's journey on the day. So there are 12 nodes in all, A1 to A12. In the first one, she's kind of arriving off of the train, and then she progresses to meet the curator. She moves through the park. She meets with the Lady Violet that she's there to speak with, and they have a walking conversation. And that kind of takes you. That's the kind of the backbone of the story. They're all located, so everything which has a dark spot on it is located, which means you have to be in a specific place in the park in order to read it. So that was the kind of the main thrust of the story. However, as you followed Sandy through the park, we also had these B nodes. These were the letters that were written by Sandy's great uncle Harry to this woman Blanche that he'd fallen in love with. And these are letters that Sandy brought with them. And as you follow Sandy through the day, you're invited to kind of move to various places in the park and then read one of those letters that's in her backpack. Now, these are all optional. You don't have to read them in order to progress onto the next sort of part of Sandy's story. And the way that they're set up is they kind of appear in the environment around the main story nodes. It's up to you then whether or not you go and read the next story node and move the story forward, or whether you want to linger and read some of those particular letters. And then the kind of the third part of the story is a little separate story called The Bones of Time. One of the heirlooms that Sandy's brought with her is actually the rib bone of an elephant that escaped from Crystal Palace Zoo. So this is the story of that elephant, The Bones of Time. It kind of takes you out of Sandy's story and takes you back to experience what it would have been like to have that elephant rampaging around the park back in the day of Crystal Palace. So about halfway through the story, you're given the option to go and activate that. It takes you up to a separate area on a terrace, Those aren't ordered, so you can read those in any order. And then once you've read, the final node, the C9 node, it will take you back to the main story again, and you can kind of carry on. And there is a last part of the story, which is a kind of denouement. So having got to the end of the story, essentially all of the letters that you could have found along the way are released to you, but this time they're not locked to location. So in theory, you could come away from the experience having finished it, and you could load it back up on your smartphone, and you could read these letters, in any order once you were away from the park. So that's the kind of the structure, and that's how it's set out. So how did we use the toolkit to put this together, and what were the principles we were using? Well, in terms of the deal breakers, the first thing is that we have this tour that effectively, this canyon that effectively goes through the park, and it's a circular route. So it starts and ends at Crystal Palace Station, with Sandy, actually arriving at the park and then leaving again. And not everyone comes in through that entrance, but it is a major entrance to the park, and a lot of people will do, because of course it's part of the tube network in London. So that was a key idea for us, that you start and ended in the same sort of place, and that you had a circular route. So the second thing we did was to try and avoid double backs. So double backs are those times where you're not being mindful of the reader's effort to move. So for example, you send them 500 yards in one direction to read a node, and then immediately bring them back to where they were again. And they get really annoyed if you do that. So we dealt with that by playing with the structure within the story. So for example, sometimes we had letters that appeared in more than one place in the park. So as you progressed, you weren't necessarily you didn't have to go back to read them effectively. Or we also had things where reading one letter would remove another one from the experience, and that meant that you could choose to either go this route and get that letter, or go that route and do the other one. But in both cases, you would then be encouraged to move on with the story, because if you went back to get the other letter, it would involve having a kind of a double back. So we had to think a little bit about those, and there were just a few cases we needed to deal with that. And then lastly, we wanted to try and keep to a manageable length. We were aiming for about an hour-long experience. So we did that by keeping the sub-story, The Bones of Time, as a kind of an optional piece. And we had an author's note at the beginning of the story. It's the very first node that people read, that explains that about halfway through you'll get off of this optional story. And also we explained that at the end, if you missed any of the letters, you'd have the chance to read them again. So again, we tried to remove the pressure to kind of collect all the fragments, so people could have a manageable experience that fit roughly within an hour, and could kind of modify what they were doing based on how much time they had. So in terms of pragmatics, we use landscape to control the flow in a couple of locations. So in particular, in the Bones of Time story, so you went up onto the top terrace, and we essentially, it's an open story, so all of the nodes are available to you all at once. However, the route that you take through that terrace will naturally mean that you read them in a particular order. So you will start off with C2. And then as you walk through the terrace, you'll ultimately end up at the far end where C9 is, which is where you'll be pushed back into the main story again. Right. So, and the other thing we did is we identified a couple of high cost locations. So there was one point where there was a far end of a terrace that was a long way away. There was another where there was quite a steep hill. And basically we put optional letter fragments up there. So none of the core A nodes, Sandy's journey, none of those things are at places that are hard to get to. And we also thought about the aesthetics quite a bit as well. So there's plenty of points of interest. So the grand steps, for example, these sphinxes, other statues around the place. So we use those as points, as destinations, right? Not necessarily in the story itself, but as places where people would naturally be drawn to. We tried to use narrative areas. So actually, the Bones of Time is a good example of that. So the Bones of Time happens off in a separate area. So you're following on Sandy's journey. If you activate the Bones of Time, you're taken up onto a different terrace. The Bones of Time happens there, and at the end of that, you're drawn back down again, back to Sandy's story and back to the main event. And we also, we worked hard with Katie to try and understand the sort of themes of the place and get them integrated with the story. So Crystal Palace is really a place about kind of past glory, and absence and loss. This remarkable building that used to be there is kind of completely absent, and you just have the kind of the foundations and the space. So we really wanted to create a story that was kind of resonant with those themes and kind of connected in that kind of way. So finally, I thought I'd leave you with just a little excerpt from the story, which demonstrates one of the magic moments that we observed with people. And this is a letter from Sandy's great uncle, from Harry to Blanche, talking about a day he spent in the park with his regiment. And it's located at one of the Sphinx statues, and he makes reference to the Sphinx. And what happens is you're reading the story, you get to this point where he's recalling what's going on, and you actually see a picture that was taken at the time that's been included with the letter, and you look up and you essentially see the location of that picture in front of you, and it just creates that moment of connection, that moment between the time of Harry, the First World War, Crystal Palace in its heyday, and you now visiting the park in the 21st century, and it just brings those two moments together.
Last night I wandered the pleasure grounds of Crystal Palace, almost unrecognisable now with its Royal Navy identity. I hoped I would feel closer to you, but each day our shared memories only served to remind me of your absence. We had a regiment photograph today at the Sphinx on the south transept. I tormented myself as I remembered how it shielded us as I held you in my arms. Now all I can do is pray for it, for the protection it may give us both. The 9th could not come sooner, if only to be united with you once more.
Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I just want to take the opportunity to thank all of the people who contributed to StoryPlaces over the years, the research fellows on the project, my fellow academics, particularly collaborators in English, and of course the technical team who actually put StoryPlaces together. You can visit StoryPlaces at storyplaces.sutton.ac.uk, read more about the project, and you can actually access the stories themselves. If you are in Southampton or Bournemouth or Crystal Palace, then you can actually access the stories using a mobile device and experience them as intended. But if you're just curious and you want to have a little look, then if you activate the story and if you go up to the advanced tab at the top, you'll find there's a demo mode where you can navigate just by scrolling the map. So it is possible to read the stories in that way. Although, of course, if really the whole point of everything I've been saying today is that they're designed to be read on site, and that's how you get the real experience. StoryPlaces was all about understanding how story and place work together. But as we've tried to point out, what actually happens is that you end up with getting a combined experience that kind of synthesizes these two things. And if you can get the balance of attention right, then you achieve this kind of harmony. You create the opportunities for these magic moments, and the experience becomes really very special indeed. So anyway, thank you very much for listening.